Hey guys, welcome to HipHughes History. We're so glad that you made it because I got a little pot on the stove here of the Russian Revolution. I'm going to cook you up a meal of learning. That's right guys, big ideas, context, vocabs, things that anybody can understand. Certainly this isn't going to write your historical research paper for you. You're going to have to do a little bit of more of the learning and the reading, but we certainly think that we can get you the basics. So why don't you sit back, put your feet up, get a drink, because I think I hear the train of learning coming, and she's stopping at the station of now. Alright, so I would start off by saying there's probably 5 or 6 causes, probably 3 big ones. The first one is definitely absolute monarchism. Russia, for hundreds and hundreds of years, 1500 years or something, basically had an absolute monarch system. Not unlike the divine kings of England or France or Italy or wherever. The Russians were called czars. And the czars wielded divine right, absolute power. And they certainly sometimes had benevolent leaders, Peter the Great, but then they also had Ivan the Terrible. So depending on who you were dealt with, what bloodline ran into the palace, that's really, what determined the type of government that you had. And certainly Nicholas II, vocab, Hughes got vocab. Nicholas II is the last Tsar of Russia. And Nicholas II is a little bit conservative, a little bit traditional. Doesn't like the idea of not being a divine king. And that's probably cause number 1, because in 1905, there is the first revolution. So, in a sense, we can even go to the second cause of the major revolution, which is the first revolution. In 1905, I believe it was a priest who brought a list of grievances to the Winter Palace. There were tens of thousands of workers on strike, and he was representing those workers who were beginning to form what were called Soviets, kind of representative bodies of the workers who felt that they were getting screwed. They're working 13 hours a day, they're getting paid almost nothing, they're cramped into little apartments, they have no rights. So this list of grievances, which included freedom of speech, and it included, like we said, workers' rights, an increase in pay, women's work pay, 8-hour workday, and representational government. They thought that the Tsar would be like, okay, let's talk it out. And what happened was, I think the Tsar wasn't home, and the priest walks in with all the people. They got a little list, bang, 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 bloody Sunday. This is called Bloody Sunday. And whether the Tsar knew it or not, it's going to have humongous ripple effects across Russia. You're going to have massive protests, really forcing Nicholas II, right, into a bind. Even he can see the writing on the wall. If this guy doesn't throw a dog biscuit, the kingdom's going to come a-crashing down. So he issues what's called the October Manifesto, and in the October Manifesto he makes a series of promises. One of them is to give people the right of representation. In a sense, setting up like a Great Britain system of a parliamentary democracy with a monarch. It's called the Duma. And people were supposed to be able to have representation in the Duma, and they would share power with the Tsar, and psych! That's why it's a cause of the 1917 revolution. I think that Nicholas II had an opportunity here to share power, and maybe, history's a different story if he does that. Maybe the Russia of today doesn't even have a Soviet Union past. It's more of a, parliamentary monarchy system. Who knows what could have happened? But because that he reneged on that deal, because he abolished the Duma after he created it, he wouldn't share power. He's just like, nah in the corner. He's really pushing Russia over the brink into revolution. All right, let's go find another cause of the Russian Revolution because I'm talking too much. Here we go. I'm trying to list them in order, but it's hard to list them in order because all of these causes are big causes. World War I, that might even rank on top of the 1905 Russian Revolution. World War I is just cray-cray. It's a disaster. And I think that Nicholas II believed that the war would benefit him, that nationalism and patriotism, people would come running to the Tsar, he would be the great leader again, but he gets his ass whooped. Not only does he get his ass whooped, but he becomes like commander of the army and gets his ass whooped, which makes it even worse. Now, the Ottoman Empire, which allied with Germany, is a humongous southern blockade now. So the Russians can't get supplies. They begin to run out of food. Prices soar through the roof. You have huge inflation. You have massive urbanization and poverty. So these economic reasons, along with the deaths, there's like 10 million casualties for the Russians in World War I. 10 million? 10 million, like 2 million dead. It's just crazy that this is beginning like a sewer to back up. And that's going to be a cause of the Russian Revolution. Another reason would be the philosophy of Marxism. So I see it right there. I'm going to go grab the Marxism, throw it at you.
Buy it, use it, break it, fix it, trash it, change it, melt, upgrade it, charge it, point it, zoom it, press it, snap it, work it, quick.
This is not a philosophy course. You just have to understand the very, very basics of Marxism. And there's two things I want to explain to you. One of them is Marxism. The other one is Marxist-Leninism. Marxism is a philosophy by Karl Marx, who wrote books like Das Kapital, that is really like a way of looking at the world. And he sees the world through glasses where everything is kind of colored by property and money and ownership. And he sees really the future of the world going towards a split, where you have a group of people, the majority are the workers. They're called the proletarian. That's the vocab up on the wall. The proletarian are the ones who work and work and work and never get ahead because they don't own what they create. They're working for wages. And in Karl Marx's mind, everything is tainted by this. Relationships and money and opportunity, everything. On the other side, you have the bourgeoisie. Now, if that's just not the most fun word to say ever, bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are the property owners, the artisans and the merchants, the business owners, the ones that really are making more money in Marx's mind with working less. That just ownership alone is giving them the right to capital, and this is splitting the world. So he basically sees the end all as communism, where the proletarian will eventually wake up with numbers. They will elect governments that are socialistic governments, which basically share the resources for the betterment of all. And then eventually, communism isn't even a government. Communism is a stateless system of utopia, where everybody shares, and I forget what the quote is. The quote is, "From each according to his ability, to each according of his need." Kind of this concept that everybody will give and take what they want and what they need, and it'll all work out. I'm not even going there. Now, Marxist-Leninism is a little bit different. What Lenin said, and this is Vladimir Lenin, he will be basically the head of the Russian Revolution, the first dictator of the Soviet Union. He takes Marxism one step further, and he says, if we wait for this to naturally develop, we'll all be dead. So what we need is a dictatorship of the proletarian. We need a political party to represent the interest of the workers before they even know what their interests are. And by driving that through military leadership, you can create the socialism necessary to create eventually communism. So he's basically Marx with a gun, right? So that would be another major cause. I would stick with those three. I mean, you could talk about, the Germans. There's a major propaganda arm in Russia because of the war. You have rapid industrialization, which has occurred. You could put that as a reason. The fact that you had characters that are really weird in the story, like Rasputin. Look at that guy. Now, you just went, I know you went, Now, what if I told you that not only is he a freakoid, that he is a Russian mystic, religious figure who can heal people, that also was a sex addict, that has a story about things that I don't even want to talk about because I'll get censored? He is advising the Tsar and his wife. And he's advising them on military matters. The Tsar was, I think, infatuated with him and his wife, certainly, because he claimed that he could heal their hemophilia, which is a blood disease that runs in families that hook up with each other, and now it's just gone off the wall, and it's nuts. Rasputin, I think, is another reason for the Russian Revolution. The people they already don't trust their government. Now they're hanging out and taking orders from that guy? Eeks! All right, let's get on to the revolution. Revolution! All right, so it's the end of 1916. Even the nobles know that something bad is going to happen. They tried to kind of blunt the force of the trauma by taking out Rasputin themselves. And that's a really great story. You should Google it right now. Do that right now in another window. Death of Rasputin. I believe that let me get this right. They invite him to a party. They get the guy drunk on cyanide. They give him all this poison to kill him. Doesn't kill him, right? Then they got nervous because they poisoned him, so they shot him in the back. Then when they checked on the body, he had gotten up, tried to crawl away. So then they beat him to death, they bully clubbed him, they shot him in the chest. And then, I guess he's still breathing, so they put him in a bag or a box, they throw him in the river, and they end up finding out that he tried to claw his way out and he had water in his lungs. That might be a little bit of embellishment on the internet, but it's a great story. All right, so by 1917, we're at the end here, guys. The February Revolution. And remember, there's two revolutions. There's the February Revolution, which is a moderate revolution, and then the Radical Revolution, the Communist Revolution in October. So basically, Petrograd, which was St. Petersburg, they changed the name, had a mini kind of strike develop. The Petrograd workers went on strike, the industrial workers. There's like 50,000 of them. By March, the whole city is shut down, and they start really kind of revolting. They're ripping down statues of the Tsar. The Tsar kind of goes a little nuts, tries to get the army to squash the rebellion. The army's like, ain't gonna do it, I'm not gonna do it now. We're with them. And basically, the Tsar regime falls apart. The Tsar is put under house arrest. They stopped his train, took him off the train, and now the Duma, which was created in 1905 to share power with the Tsar, is now in complete power. So let's take a look at February to October and find out why this provisional government, which was a very social democratic orientated government that believed in civil liberties, why it didn't last. Because I think if it lasted, if it did some things differently, the world would be a lot different today. All right, so this is the period that some historians will call the dual power period, even though it's not really dual power. Dual power means you got two institutions that are running the country. The real one running the country is the provisional government. And the provisional government was a bourgeoisie government. You know, people that basically owned property and had influence, the elites of society. They're running the country, and they're basically social democrats, like Europeans. You know, they want to vote, they want freedom, they want private property, they want capitalism. They want ownership of property and these sorts of things. And then you had the corresponding Soviets. These Soviets that were formed in 1905, in the 1905 revolution, that see themselves not as representing all of the people, but they literally see themselves as representing the interest of the workers. And in that period, in the beginning of that period, from what I've read, they didn't see an opportunity for them to take over. They didn't think Russia was ready for revolution. They saw themselves as like a political lobby group. And they met where the government met, but they didn't vote. They put influence on the bourgeoisie to make sure that the rights of the workers, the interests of the workers, were being legitimately, looked after. Kind of like unions in America, I would say. But the provisional government makes a big mistake. Now, the leader of the provisional government, Alexander Kerensky, right? He was actually a socialist. He kind of crossed over. There's different socialists. We can't do all of it, guys. But the main ones were the Mensheviks, and then you have the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks are much more radical. They don't want to work with the provisional government. Kind of like this in the corner, kind of pissed. And that's Lenin, and that's what, the Trotsky is another name. But Kerensky, he's not a Bolshevik. He's kind of a Democrat, social democrat, Menshevik kind of guy. So he crosses over and runs the provisional government. So the provisional government is really moderate. It's like center-left, I guess, in today's politics. But they make a huge mistake. And the mistake is they don't get out of World War I. So by not getting out of World War I, even doing all of the other things correctly, like freedom of speech and representation and, these types of social Western democratic concepts, the people are pissed. They're pissed because there's still conscription. They're still losing the war. They have a humongously bad economy. People are starving to death. There's humongous riots and strikes going on. And at the end of the day, they can't keep the lid on the pot. So let's move on. So Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, these are the two Bolsheviks, the radical communists, the ones that want to create this dictatorship of the proletariat. They're really on the outs. At the beginning of the revolution of February of 1917, I believe that the Bolsheviks only had about 20,000 members. And even at the height of the revolution in October, they only had about 200,000. So this is a real minority that's going to take power. It's truly the dictatorship of the proletariat, a small group that represents the interests of the workers, who's going to basically hijack the government in the interest of socialism and communism. So Lenin, who was exiled to Switzerland, comes back, I believe, in April of 1917 after his political party wasn't banned anymore by the Social Democrats, the provisional government, and the Germans fund him and secretly get him through the front through a train to get him back. The Germans, initially they love the idea of the Bolsheviks taking over. They're for Lenin. They're paying for his ride because he represents the idea that maybe Russia will get out of the war. So you have Lenin and Trotsky now, these kind of little rebel rousers in Petrograd. And during the provisional government, when everything's kind of going to hell in a handbasket, a couple things happen. One of them is a spontaneous revolution in July by the workers of Petrograd. They took to the streets and they were marching, yelling, "All power to the Soviets." And really, this was probably the chance for the Bolsheviks to take over, but they folded. Lenin didn't support it right away. He didn't want the revolution. He was exiled to Finland. They arrest Trotsky. And really that first Bolshevik revolution in July was crushed. And then in August, something else happens. In August, the military tries a coup. The military tries to take over the provisional government, really to have a dictatorship of authoritarian totalitarianism by the military. And what happened was Kerensky, the provisional leader, and I know I got a lot of names going on here, he falls back to getting the Bolsheviks to defend him. The Bolsheviks were the soldiers, many of them. Many of them were, Navy officers and workers, and they're called up to defend the city of Petrograd. So Kerensky now owes the provisional government's life to the Bolsheviks. So he releases Trotsky out of jail, and then Lenin comes back from Finland, and then by the end of September, near October, the Bolsheviks see their chance. So what's really interesting, and I don't think a lot of people understand this, is that the October Revolution is pretty much a bloodless revolution. It's not a revolution like the American Revolution against the British. It's not a French Revolution where all these people run around with their heads cut off. It's really a coordinated, planned revolution. And I think that's what it owes its success to. The October Revolution is not the February Revolution. The February Revolution was chaotic. It was crazy. It just kind of happened. And out of that chaos, you had a chaotic provisional government. But Trotsky and Lenin planned this bad boy. With the control of the Soviets, taking a majority in major cities, they basically voted through the Soviets to dissolve the provisional government. And that's what happens. At the end of October, in 1917, the Soviet Union is created and the provisional government is dissolved, and we got ourselves the Soviet Union. How do you like that? With the dictator Lenin, the dictatorship of the proletarian volcano. All right, guys, we finally got there. So what are the effects of the Communist Revolution of 1917? Whoa! That's the first effect, 20th century, baby. The whole 20th century is basically defined by this kind of, us versus them world of the Soviet Union being the engine of communism, trying to spread it around the world, and the United States and the Allied powers trying to stomp it out around the world. So that's really going to be the major effect, is that we've split the world in a sense. Now, this really doesn't come into fruition until after World War II, because the Soviet Union immediately faced, this is another effect, its own civil war. From 1918 to 1923, the Russians fought themselves. The White Army, who was basically all the groups against the communists. And look, when the communists start seizing land to share the wealth, you're going to piss off a lot of farmers. And those farmers and the bourgeoisie and the business owners and even radicals on the right, fascists and people that are for, a different style of totalitarianism, unite. And they unite with lots of Momo. Japan is feeding them money. Great Britain is feeding them money. The United States is a humongous financial supporter of the White Army, even giving them military advisor with some boots on the ground. So the White Army fights the Red Army for, what is it going to be, 5 years? Millions of deaths, just chaos, death, and destruction as the Soviet Union eventually comes under complete control of the communists. And what the communists did, the first thing they do, it's a one-party rule. They ban other political parties. They're going to cleanse the party of idealism and opposition and pluralism. Pluralism, democracy, voting, these sorts of things get in the way of the dictatorship of the proletarian, which is on this march for socialism and communism. What else? The Tsar is dead. The provisional government kept him alive, but during the Civil War, the Red Army didn't want any sort of legacy hanging out. So not only did they shoot the Tsar, but they shot his wife, they shot all of his children. That's just kind of a sad story right there. Another effect is absolutely going to be the Russians pulling out of World War I. The Bolsheviks said they would do it, and they live up to their word. They pull out of World War I, and it's probably going to be one of the reasons they're going to be able to sustain power. Because they pulled out of the war, they're seen as the ones who did what they said they were going to do. But the major effect on World War I is it's going to pull the United States into World War I and sending troops across the Atlantic Ocean into Europe. And I think that's really going to nosedive into the United States, even though we retreat to isolationism as being a world power. So thanks, Soviet Union. We hope that you learned something. We hope that you wrinkled your brain. And we hope that you subscribe to HipHughes, because how else are you going to help me out other than clicking the subscription button, you dummies? I love you. Make sure that you click the description below. There's tons of other EDU channels I've listed there for you, so you should go check them out and get the motto down. Where attention goes, energy flows. Because that's true. It's the only thing I know that's true for real.